On the morning of June 6, 1944, the fate of Europe hung on a narrow strip of coastline along Normandy. For nearly 4 years, Nazi Germany had occupied much of Western Europe, fortifying the coast, draining resources, and spreading fear across an entire continent. Behind closed doors, Allied planners understood that the war could not be won without opening a massive second front in the West. That moment arrived under storm-gray skies as US and British forces, supported by their allies, launched what would become the most ambitious amphibious assault in human history. For months before the invasion, secrecy ruled everything. Soldiers trained in England without knowing their final destination. Commanders used false radio traffic, fake armies, and inflatable tanks to convince German intelligence that the main attack would land at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. This deception campaign, later known as Operation Fortitude, worked. German high command kept powerful armored divisions away from the real landing zone, waiting for an invasion that never came. When the true assault began, it struck where the enemy least expected it. In the early hours before dawn, Allied aircraft roared across the English Channel. Paratroopers from the United States and United Kingdom jumped into darkness behind enemy lines, their mission dangerously precise. They were to seize bridges, disrupt German communications, and prevent reinforcements from reaching the beaches. Many landed far from their drop zones due to heavy fire and cloud cover, yet small groups regrouped and fought anyway. Their scattered resistance created confusion among German defenders, buying precious time for the landings to come. As dawn approached, the sea itself became a battlefield. More than 5,000 ships, warships, landing craft, transport vessels moved toward the French coast. Battleships opened fire, sending massive shells into German fortifications. The sound was continuous, rolling like thunder across the water. From the decks of landing craft, soldiers stared toward a coastline hidden by smoke and dust, knowing that in minutes they would be running directly into enemy fire. The invasion front stretched roughly 50 miles and was divided into 5 beaches. Omaha and Utah were assigned to American forces. Gold and Sword were designated for British troops, while Juno went to Canadian units. Each beach had its own terrain, defenses, and challenges, but Omaha would become the most infamous. German positions there sat on high bluffs, overlooking narrow stretches of sand covered with obstacles, mines, and steel hedgehogs designed to rip open landing craft. At Utah Beach, American troops landed slightly off target, but this mistake worked in their favor. German defenses were lighter than expected, and U.S. forces moved inland more quickly than planned. Casualties were relatively low compared to other sectors. Officers made rapid decisions, choosing to push forward rather than regroup on the shore, setting the tone for flexibility under fire that would characterize the day. Omaha Beach told a different story. As landing craft doors dropped, soldiers were met by devastating machine gun fire. Entire units were cut down before reaching cover. Tanks meant to support the infantry sank in rough seas before reaching shore. For hours, progress stalled as men pinned behind obstacles fought for survival. Leadership at the lowest levels became decisive. Small groups advanced up the bluffs using grenades, rifles, and sheer determination. By afternoon, gaps finally opened in the German defenses, and the Americans secured a fragile foothold. British forces at Gold Beach faced strong resistance, but benefited from specialized armored vehicles designed to clear mines and obstacles. Engineers worked under fire to create exits from the beach, allowing troops to push inland. By the end of the day, British units had advanced further than many planners thought possible, capturing key positions and threatening German supply routes. At Sword Beach, British troops landed closest to the city of Cannes, a critical objective. Although initial landings succeeded, progress slowed when German armored units counterattacked. Fierce fighting erupted as Allied anti-tank weapons clashed with German panzers. Despite delays, the British held their ground, preventing the enemy from driving them back into the sea. Throughout the day, the air above Normandy remained crowded with Allied aircraft. Fighters strafed roads and columns, bombers struck rail lines, and transport planes dropped supplies to paratroopers still fighting behind enemy lines. German air response was limited and disorganized. Years of Allied bombing had weakened the Luftwaffe, and fuel shortages grounded many aircraft. Air superiority belonged firmly to the Allies. By nightfall on June 6th, more than 156,000 Allied troops had landed in France. Casualties were severe, over 10,000 killed, wounded, or missing, but the invasion had succeeded. A beachhead now existed in Western Europe. German commanders, still uncertain whether this was the main attack or a diversion, hesitated to commit all available forces. The hesitation proved fatal. In the days that followed, Allied engineers worked relentlessly to bring ashore supplies, vehicles, and artillery. Temporary harbors, known as mulberries, were assembled at sea and floated into position. These artificial ports allowed the Allies to unload thousands of tons of equipment daily, sustaining the growing army on French soil. German attempts to disrupt the buildup failed under constant air and naval bombardment. The fighting inland was brutal. Normandy's hedgerows turned fields into natural fortresses. Progress was slow and costly, especially for American units pushing toward the town of St. Lay. Yet the sheer scale of Allied resources began to tell. More troops arrived each day. More tanks rolled off ships. More aircraft filled the skies. German forces, stretched thin and lacking fuel and replacements, struggled to respond. For US and UK forces, D-Day was more than a single battle. It was the opening of a campaign that would roll relentlessly eastward. The invasion forced Germany to fight on two major fronts against the Soviets in the east and the Western Allies in France. This strategic pressure shattered German ability to concentrate its strength, accelerating the collapse of Nazi control across Europe. By late summer 1944, Paris was liberated. By autumn, Allied armies stood at Germany's borders. Less than a year after the landings at Normandy, Berlin would fall, and the war in Europe would end. Looking back, historians agree that June 6, 1944, marked the point of no return. The invasion did not end the war overnight, but it made German defeat inevitable. D-Day remains a symbol of coordination, sacrifice, and resolve. American and British forces, alongside their allies, demonstrated that massive planning combined with individual courage could overcome even the most fortified enemy positions. The beaches of Normandy became not just a battleground, but a turning point that reshaped the modern world. The success of the landings on June 6, 1944 did not mean victory was immediate. In many ways, D-Day was only the beginning of a far longer and more brutal struggle. Once ashore in Normandy, Allied forces faced a determined enemy fighting from prepared positions in terrain that favored defense. The German army had been forced to react, but it was far from defeated. What followed in the weeks after D-Day would test the endurance, leadership, and adaptability of US and British forces in ways few had anticipated. Normandy's countryside quickly revealed itself as a nightmare for attackers. The region was crisscrossed by hedgerows, thick earthen banks, topped with dense vegetation that divided fields into small compartments. These natural barriers limited visibility, slowed movement, and turned every field into a potential ambush site. German troops used the hedgerows to conceal anti-tank guns and machine gun nests, inflicting heavy casualties on advancing Allied units. Progress was measured not in miles, but in yards. American forces pushing inland from Omaha and Utah beaches bore the brunt of this fighting. Infantry units learned to advance cautiously, often engaging in close-quarters combat that blurred the line between offense and survival. Tanks struggled to maneuver, their guns unable to depress low enough to hit enemies hidden behind embankments. In response, American soldiers improvised. Steel prongs welded onto tank fronts allowed them to punch through hedgerows, restoring mobility and firepower. These adaptations reflected a broader truth of the campaign. Victory would depend not just on planning, but on learning faster than the enemy. British forces east of the American sectors faced a different challenge. Their objective was the city of Caen, a major road and rail hub vital to any advance toward Germany. The Germans recognized its importance and defended it fiercely. British units launched repeated attacks, supported by massive artillery and air bombardment. The fighting around Caen became a grinding battle of attrition. Although progress was slow, the British achieved a critical strategic effect by tying down German armored divisions that might otherwise have been used against American forces to the west. While ground combat raged, Allied logistics quietly became one of the decisive factors of the war. The temporary mulberry harbors continued to deliver men, vehicles, ammunition, and fuel at an unprecedented rate. Engineers repaired ports, cleared mines, and built roads under constant threat of attack. Each day, the Allied presence in France grew stronger. German forces, by contrast, struggled with shortages. Fuel was scarce, reinforcements were limited, and Allied air power made movement by day extremely dangerous. Air superiority proved relentless. Allied aircraft dominated the skies, striking bridges, railways, and troop concentrations far behind the front lines. German attempts to reposition units were often detected and destroyed before they reached the battlefield. This constant pressure isolated German forces in Normandy, preventing coordinated counteroffensives. What had begun as a tactical invasion evolved into a strategic stranglehold. The turning point of the Normandy campaign came in late July 1944 with the launch of a massive American offensive designed to break out of the hedgerows. After days of aerial bombardment, U.S. forces surged forward, exploiting weakened German defenses. Once the front cracked, mobility returned to the battlefield. American armored units poured through the gaps, advancing rapidly into open countryside. German formations, unable to regroup, began to collapse. As U.S. forces drove south and east, British and Canadian units increased pressure around Cannes, finally pushing the Germans back. The coordinated Allied advance threatened to encircle large portions of the German army. Desperate counterattacks failed. Thousands of German troops were killed, captured, or forced to retreat in disarray. Normandy, once a fortress, became a trap. With German resistance breaking, the Allied advance accelerated. Town after town fell as liberation spread across France. Civilians emerged from years of occupation to greet Allied soldiers as liberators. For many, this was the first visible sign that Nazi Germany could be defeated. The psychological impact was enormous, both for occupied Europe and for German forces watching their defensive line crumble. In August 1944, Allied units approached Paris. Although not initially planned as a primary objective, the symbolic importance of the French capital could not be ignored. Resistance fighters within the city rose up against German occupiers as Allied troops closed in. When Allied forces entered Paris, scenes of celebration echoed around the world. The liberation of the city became one of the defining images of the war, representing the collapse of German control in Western Europe. From France, the momentum carried forward. Allied armies crossed into Belgium and the Netherlands, pushing toward Germany's borders. Supply lines stretched, weather worsened, and German resistance stiffened in places, but the strategic balance had permanently shifted. German forces were now fighting a defensive war on their own territory, under constant pressure from multiple directions. One of the last major German attempts to reverse the situation came during the winter of 1940-45, when German forces launched a surprise counteroffensive in the Ardennes region. The resulting battle tested Allied resolve, but it ultimately failed to change the outcome. Allied industrial capacity, manpower, and coordination absorbed the shock and responded with overwhelming force. Once the offensive was repelled, the road into Germany lay open. By early 1945, Allied armies crossed the Rhine River, a psychological and strategic barrier long considered Germany's last line of defense. Cities fell in rapid succession. German infrastructure collapsed under sustained bombing and ground assault. Civilians fled westward as fighting reached deep into the heart of the Reich. German command structures disintegrated, and resistance became increasingly fragmented. For United States and United Kingdom, the final months of the war in Europe were defined by relentless advance and grim discovery. As Allied troops liberated concentration camps, the full scale of Nazi crimes became undeniable. The war was no longer just about territory or strategy, it was about ending a regime built on terror and mass murder. In April 1945, Allied forces from the west linked up with Soviet forces advancing from the east. Germany was effectively split in two. With Berlin surrounded and his army shattered, Adolf Hitler committed suicide. On May 7, 1945, Germany formally surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Looking back, historians consistently identify D-Day as the moment that made this outcome inevitable. Without the successful landings in Normandy, there would have been no sustained Allied presence in Western Europe, no liberation of France, and no rapid collapse of German defenses. D-Day forced Germany into a war it could not win, draining resources and breaking strategic coherence. The legacy of D-Day extends far beyond military history. It demonstrated the power of coalition warfare, where nations with different cultures and capabilities united around a shared objective. It showed how preparation, deception, logistics, and individual courage could combine to overcome seemingly insurmountable defenses. It reshaped the geopolitical landscape of Europe and laid the groundwork for the post-war world. For the soldiers who landed on the beaches of Normandy, D-Day was a moment of personal terror and sacrifice. Many never returned home. Those who survived carried memories that lasted a lifetime. Their actions ensured that Europe would not remain under Nazi domination, and that the principles of freedom and self-determination would have a chance to endure. Today, the beaches of Normandy are quiet, the guns are silent. Yet the significance of what happened there remains undiminished. June 6, 1944 stands as a reminder that history can turn on a single day, and that the outcome of global conflict can hinge on the courage of individuals willing to step forward into uncertainty. D-Day did not end the war in one stroke, but it opened the door to victory. And once that door was forced open by US and UK forces, it could never be closed again.